Okay guys, here's the wine rack we're going to build today. It's got a spot for 5 of your favorite bottles of wine down here in the metal racks or up top, take your pick. It's even got a spot for a couple of wine glasses and a cute little slide out cheese board. It's a fun little project you can build in a weekend. Stick around, we'll get right into it. So we're starting out with rough sawn lumber, which is what I typically like to start with, and as long as you have a joiner and a planer, it's no problem. We've got mostly walnut for our stock today, but we'll throw in a little bit of maple for a little bit of contrast. Let's get going. Okay, we'll get a sharp combination blade on the Fusion F2. This is a 40-tooth combination blade and does a pretty good job for not only ripping cuts, but it'll handle your cross cuts as well. So it's nice just to install one blade and stick with it. Single wrench blade change system on the Laguna. You can just raise the blade up all the way and spin it until the blade lock engage and go ahead and tighten it home. And we'll drop the locking throat plate in place and go to work. Okay, so we've milled down both some maple and some walnut so that it's S4S and ready for our project. And at this point we have walnut that's 6.5 wide, so that'll give us 13 inches worth of the panel. Our plans call for 16-inch wide panels, so we'll need 3-inch strips of these maple. Okay, now I think we can square an end and roughly cut these pieces to about 16-inch for our finished 14-inch size. We'll leave them a little overlong now so that they can plane or sand up real nice. Okay, so these pieces will be the cleats for the wine rack, and we'll need 4 of those. They're 1 inch thick by 1.5 inches wide, and they need to be cut to 9.5 long. While we're at it, we might as well rip some pieces for the cheese board that will slide out from underneath the wine rack. The pieces of walnut for the cheese board actually need to be a little bit asymmetrical. The front piece is wider at 3.25 inches, and the back piece of the cheese board will be thinner at 2.25 inches, and that's just so the maple strips will look symmetrical once the board is slid under the wine rack. And then we'll need a couple of 1-inch wide strips for decorative accents to the cheese board. We'll cut those now. Alright, well, we've done some of the basic prep work here to prepare our panels, and you can kind of get a sneak peek as to what these contrasting panels are going to look like. We've got the wider panels that are walnut, and then the narrow strip down the middle that's going to be maple, and it just gives a nice contrast. Even the bare wood gives a really beautiful contrast, but once we wipe some oil or a finish on there, it's really going to bring that to life. One of the things I want to talk about with this is a really fundamental concept of how to make flat panels. So let's go over how to mark and joint each edge of the board so that when you glue the panel together, it maintains a perfectly flat surface for your project. Okay, so our panels are still loose here, and the idea is we want to mark each edge of the board to indicate how it's going to be passed over the jointer so that we can maintain perfectly 90-degree cuts for a flat panel. And the way we do that is we mark I's and O's. One board receives an I, the next edge receives an O. I, O, and on like that. We'll mark all of our boards like that with I's and O's. It doesn't matter which you start with. What's important is that an I is next to an O. The I stands for in against the fence of the joiner. O stands for out, away from the fence of the joiner. And that way, by presenting one board with the surface out away from the joiner and the mating board in towards the joiner fence, if your joiner is not exactly set to 90 degrees at the fence, these two angles will counteract each other and you'll still wind up with a perfectly flat panel when you're done. Okay, here's my eye mark, so I know that this face of the board will go inward towards the joiner fence, and we'll make that cut now. And here's my O mark, so I know that this face of the board will be out away from the joiner fence. Okay, we'll need two of these end panels, which are about 16 inches wide and 14 inches tall, and we'll glue up the cheese board at the same time. I usually just put glue on one of the mating surfaces, lay down a good enough bead that we'll get a little bit of a squeeze out there. And we'll start getting these pieces set together. One thing that can help you is small clamps, just a little F clamp on each joint. Will hold things flat as you gradually tighten up the pipe clamps. Let's tighten up these pipe clamps and see if we can raise a little bead of glue. And when I see that squeeze out, I know I'm going to have a nice strong joint. And then just grab another board fresh off the joiner with a known flat edge and just check that panel for flatness. If you look like you're pretty flat in the glue up phase, you can set this aside to dry. One thing we have done is left a couple of the boards a little bit extra long. That way when we send this cheese board through the planer, if there is a little bit of snipe at one end, well then we can just trim that off and it won't be in our finished project. So choose which panel you want to have as your front to the wine rack and create a 1/2 inch dado, 3 3/4 inches from the top of the panel. And this is just a through dado. It goes all the way across the board. So adjust the width of your dado stack till it's about 3/4 of an inch. Make any shim adjustments as needed until you get a nice tight fit with a test piece. You want those cleat parts to just ease over the edge of the panel. And when you get that nice tight fit, we'll go ahead and make these dado notches on our real work pieces. We'll cut these notches so that they're 1 inch from the end of the workpiece. Okay, so here's what we've got at this point. I always like to try to dry assemble the projects and see how they're coming together. These dado notches just fit right over the panels and hold everything snugly together. Now we do have our dado cut up front, just in the front panel, and that's for the wine glass holder. The key dimension on this one though is the depth of your dado notches. They should be deep enough to just allow the cutting board panel to slide underneath the front of the project. And this is just making a little bit of contact here, so I think one more pass through the planer on our cutting board and we'll have the good dimensions there. Okay, so pull a couple of chippers off your dado stack and make it a narrower setup. Just 3/8 is all we need for this next setup. Now normally I would omit this blade stabilizer washer when I was doing wide dado blades, but you know, on this one, on a narrow 3/8 inch stack, you've got room for that, so you might as well use it. We'll just go ahead and spin on the arbor nut, depress the red locking button, and we'll tighten that stack up and make long grooves in the cleats that will receive the cheese board. Okay, so my dado notches are 3/16 inch deep, and so what I've done here is I've aligned this dado stack 3/16 from the fence, and we'll go ahead and make those through grooves in 2 of the cleats, and that'll be to accept the tongues of the cheese board. Here we go. It gives you an interesting shape where the dado notches and the grooves intersect. Just remember to do these grooves only on the bottom 2 cleats. So on the crosscut sled, we'll go ahead and trim these panels to the finished height, which is 14 inches. So now we need to cut angles on the side of the front and back panel. And to do that, I'm usually using this sliding tapering jig. It's got big toggle clamps that you can attach the piece firmly to the jig, and it just rides on a wooden runner that fits into the miter track of the table saw. So we'll use that to really uniformly trim these angles on both sides. And just make sure that the shapes came out nice and even and the front matches the back, and that looks really good with that tapering jig. Okay, so let's make the shelf for the wine glasses. We've planed this piece down to a 1/2 inch thick, and more precisely we've planed it down until it just fit into the groove in our front panel, and we'll go ahead and rip this to 3 inches wide. So we have our little wine glass shelf component here, and we just need to cut a couple of notches to receive the stem of the wine glasses, and we'll do that with the dado blade. So the thickness of the shelf has already been pre-fitted, so that should just slide right into your dado across the front panel here. We'll do a little finish trimming to get this nice and angled to match the slope of the sides, but this should support our pair of wine glasses real nice. To hold a wine bottle up on top of the rack, we'll just do a slight amount of shaping here to receive the back of the bottle and the neck of the bottle. And then as far as holding additional bottles of wine on the side, we'll mount a couple of these metal wire racks, and that'll function just great. Use the riving knife on your Fusion saw whenever you can. In fact, I almost always have my riving knife in place. We'll lock in that single throat plate and go ahead and bevel both edges of the glass shelf. And now that the bevel cuts are made, we're nice and flush on either side. A little bit of sanding after glue up, and this will look just right. And then another detail we're going to add is a slight chamfer so that the glass stem can really enter the notch for the wine glass quite easily. And so we'll work on that next. So the work with the chamfer bit is kind of soften the entrance for the stem of the wine glass, and also just the natural act of rounding over these outside corners so that they're not sharp created this interesting little profile line where the round over interacts with the beveled end. Okay, so at the top of the back panel of the wine rack, we'll go ahead and cut out a little hollow here for the large end of the wine bottle. Get the dust collection going here and make that cut. At the top of the front panel, we need a smaller radius curve, so unless you have a very small blade on the bandsaw, it may just be easier to notch this out and sand it. So we've got all our parts sanded, and what we'll do next is just glue in this little shelf for the wine glasses. So with these maple cleat components, we're going to drill 3/8" holes that are centered over the dados. And once the project is fully assembled and glued in place, why then we'll add contrasting walnut dowels. When it comes to clamping up this assembly, you'll have to get a little bit creative. I chose to use cowls on top to direct clamping pressure right where I need it on top of the maple cleats. Well, we need to cut a handful of short length dowels, 3/8 walnut dowel in this case for our project. And if you guys have ever tried to cut dowel stock at a chop saw, you know how dangerous it can be, and usually it winds up flinging the little short piece of dowel across the shop, and of course we don't want that. So let me show you a little carrier jig we've come up with so you can take advantage of some of the neat features on the Laguna 1412 bandsaw and safely and easily cut dowel stock to length. So the first thing you want to do is slide your high-low fence back. It's got a really nice sliding fence on this Laguna 1412 bandsaw, and position it so that the fence stops in front of the blade here. And then you'll be able to use a miter gauge and this simple little carrier board. It's just a piece of hardwood that has 3/8" wide groove plowed in it this way and a dado plowed in it this way. It just gives you other options of how you use this little carrier jig. But the idea is you just advance the board into the saw to trim your dowel stock, and then you can just push it forward and cut the next one. Let's check out how it works. So we've drilled out the holes in the top a little bit deeper to accommodate these 2-inch dowels, and that'll just help to reinforce these little dado joints we've got at the top. So let's go ahead and use a Q-tip that we've cut in half and add a little glue in the holes there, and we'll get those dowels inserted. And just a little flush trimming saw will help knock these pegs off flush. Okay, well, we've went ahead and flush cut and sanded the plugs. That's all looking good. And now we want to make sure that the cheese board can slide underneath this front panel. And although it does, there's a little bit of friction there. And so we'll need this cheese board just to be a little thinner, so one more slight pass through the planer and I think we'll have that thickness correct. After that, we'll go ahead and create the tongues on either end so that the cheese board will fit into these cleats. And then we'll just use a core box bit to create a little bit of a finger pull here in the front of the cheese board. We'll make that in multiple passes. We've got some decorative curves to cut at the front of the cheese board, so we'll head back over to the bandsaw to make those cuts. Okay, so we've done some finish sanding and this wine rack is just about ready for hardware. I did want to kind of show you how the cheese board comes together. It's just a little slide out operation there, and I think if I turn it on its back you'll be able to see it a little bit better. So with the little finger pull I can just slide the cheese board forward and back. It's got a nice finished look, and of course it can be separated from the wine rack and used as a little cheese board. So it's kind of a fun little feature to add to your wine rack. Well, save your offcuts by all means. That can be a nice way to test a wipe-on finish to see what the color is going to look like with this walnut and maple. And that looks great to me, so this is the one I'm going to go with. It's a Watco Danish oil in a medium walnut finish. And that's what we've selected for our wipe-on product, and it's just going to bring out the natural colors that are there, and I think it's a really pretty way to finish wood, especially the walnut there. I really like the dark color that it brings out with a little Danish oil. And just look at the richness and the color that adds when you wipe a little Watco oil or other finish of your choice on that natural walnut and maple. Really just brings out the natural beauty of the wood. Well, all that's left to do for our little wine rack is finish mounting the hardware. There's a small wrought iron hook mounted at front that receives this corkscrew, and then we'll finish mounting the wine bottle holders on the side, and this wine rack will be as good as done. Let's get those mounted. Okay guys, there it is. The wine rack all decked out with the hardware and accessories. You can have a wine bottle up on the top or down in these metal holders. They'll store up to 5 bottles of wine, and I think it's a great project that you could build for a loved one, or hey, put it in a charitable auction. I think it's a worthwhile project. Cute little cheese board that you can slide out. It's got a lot of features, so check it out, see if it's something you want to build for yourself. Thanks again for watching. We'll see you next time.